The date was October 14th, 1971. Somewhere deep in the basement archives of NBC's Burbank studios, a single 2-inch videotape reel sat inside a cardboard sleeve. The label on the spine read, in ordinary black marker, "Tonight's show, EP 1847, do not broadcast repeat." 5 words, unremarkable on their own. But those 5 words represented something extraordinary. Something that 3 of the most powerful men in Hollywood had agreed, in the early hours of the morning, over cold coffee and nervous cigarettes, could never see the light of day again. The problem with secrets, though, is that they have a way of breathing. They expand inside the walls that contain them. They whisper to archivists and interns and night shift security guards who have nothing better to do than wonder why certain tapes are stored in locked cabinets, while others sit freely on open shelves. They survive floods and fires and corporate house cleanings. They wait, and this particular secret had been waiting for a very long time. What happened on that stage on the evening of October 13th, 1971 was, depending on who you asked, either the greatest disaster in late-night television history or the most revelatory, painfully human moment that American audiences had never been allowed to see. It began, as so many catastrophes do, with an invitation. To understand what happened that night, you have to first understand what Johnny Carson meant to America in the autumn of 1971. He wasn't just a television host. He was the last voice tens of millions of Americans heard before they fell asleep. He was a man who decided, with a single raised eyebrow or a well-timed lean back in his chair, whether a joke landed or a guest was worth caring about. He was the arbiter of cool, the gatekeeper of relevance, the unofficial mayor of a country that existed only between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. 5 nights a week. Johnny had held that throne since 1962, and in 9 years, he had mastered the art of controlled chaos. He could navigate a drunk starlet, a misfiring comedian, or a political landmine with the same effortless grace. A smile here, a redirect there, a pause perfectly timed to let the audience exhale and laugh and forget. But Johnny Carson also carried something that very few people who watched him in their living rooms ever suspected. He was, beneath all that polish, a deeply anxious man. Not anxious in the way a nervous newcomer is anxious, sweating through his first audition. Johnny's anxiety was the anxiety of a man who had been performing composure for so long that he had nearly lost the ability to distinguish the performance from reality. His marriages, he was on his 3rd by 1971, had all fractured against the same jagged truth, that the warmth audiences saw was real, but it was real only in the presence of an audience. In private, Johnny Carson was distant, guarded, and sometimes so quiet that the people closest to him said it felt like being in a room with someone who had already left. He drank, not catastrophically, not yet, but methodically. Scotch, usually, because that's what men of his generation and his tax bracket drank. A glass before the show, 2 glasses after. The show itself was the interval of sobriety. 2 hours of hyper-alert presence, every nerve tuned to the room. By October 1971, Johnny was also in a slow, largely private war with NBC. Contract negotiations had been grinding for months. The network wanted more shows, more specials, more Johnny. Johnny wanted what every man who had given everything to an institution eventually wants. More control, more respect, the freedom to occasionally say no. He was, in other words, a man holding enormous power in the external world while feeling, in his internal world, increasingly cornered. And then the booking came through. 2 guests, same night, seated on the couch together, John Wayne and Dean Martin. You could not have invented 2 men more perfectly designed to fill a room and simultaneously threaten to destroy it. John Wayne, born Mary and Robert Morrison in Winterset, Iowa, in 1907, was 64 years old in the fall of 1971, and he occupied physical and cultural space like a geological formation. He was enormous in the way that certain things are enormous, not just in size, but in weight. The weight of meaning. The weight of what he represented to a generation of Americans who had grown up watching him ride across Monument Valley and plant flags and punch men in the jaw with a righteousness that seemed to come from God himself. By 1971, Wayne was also controversial in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. He had given an interview to Playboy magazine in 1971 that had detonated like a bomb across the culture. Candid, unapologetic, and in many passages, deeply uncomfortable. He had spoken about Native Americans with a casualness that horrified younger readers. He had defended white supremacy as a historical inevitability with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. And yet, John Wayne was still, by virtually every box office metric, the most bankable star in Hollywood. True Grit had just won him his only Academy Award 2 years earlier. His fan mail ran to thousands of letters a week. His America, rural, white, unapologetically masculine, untroubled by self-examination, still existed in enormous quantities, and that America loved him with a ferocity that bordered on religious devotion. He was also, in private, nothing like the monument he appeared in public. Those who worked closely with him described a man of surprising gentleness, quick humor, and complicated vulnerability. He had a gift for friendship. He laughed easily and genuinely. He was sentimental about his children in a way that embarrassed him. He had survived lung cancer, the removal of an entire lung in 1964, and that brush with mortality had given him a relationship with whiskey that was no longer casual but had not yet become a public scandal. Wayne arrived at Burbank that evening having already drunk by multiple accounts, considerably more than his constitution should have accommodated. And then there was Dean Martin. If John Wayne was a monument, Dean Martin was a river. He moved through the world with the easy, unconcerned grace of water finding its level, around obstacles, through gaps, always arriving exactly where intended, seemingly without effort. He was 54 in 1971, still devastatingly handsome in the Italian-American way that seemed to resist time through sheer indifference to it. The dark eyes still bright, the hair still improbably full, the smile still possessing that particular quality that made women of all ages feel briefly, convincingly, as though it was meant only for them. Dean Martin was also, by 1971, in one of the most peculiar phases of a peculiar career. The Rat Pack was over. The Kennedys were dead. Sinatra had turned volcanic and difficult. Sammy Davis Jr. was navigating the impossible terrain of being both the most visible black entertainer in America and a Nixon supporter. The whole world that had made Dean Martin's particular brand of effortless cool seem not just appealing but necessary had been dismantled by assassinations and Vietnam and Woodstock, and a generation that had decided that ease and elegance were forms of cowardice. Dean didn't seem to care, or rather, he performed not caring with such convincing ease that it was impossible to tell what performance ended. But there were cracks. His marriage to Jean was deteriorating. His relationship with his children was complex and often painful, particularly with his son Dino Jr., who was serving in the military and with whom Dean communicated in a halting, inadequate way that men of that generation communicated love, obliquely, infrequently, and always too late. He was drinking heavily. Not the theatrical, comedic drinking that was his stage persona, the glass of apple juice he passed off a scotch during performances, but real, serious, private drinking that the people closest to him were beginning to find alarming. He had agreed to appear on The Tonight Show that evening as a favor to Johnny. They were friends long standing, the kind of friendship that exists between men who occupy similar altitudes of fame and therefore understand each other's pressures without needing to articulate them. What he had not been told, and what he discovered only when he arrived at the studio, was that John Wayne would be sitting on the same couch. The two men had a history, not a dramatic history, not a violent or criminal history, but a history of friction, a long-running, low-grade ideological and personal tension that had been building for years, fed by political disagreements, professional jealousies, and at least one incident at a Hollywood party in 1968 that various witnesses described differently but unanimously agreed had ended badly. When Dean Martin walked into the green room at NBC Burbank and found John Wayne already there, already deep into his second drink, already filling the small room with his considerable physical presence, he reportedly stood in the doorway for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he smiled a smile, the one that meant nothing and everything. "Duke," he said. "Dino," Wayne said. And that was all. The green room at NBC Burbank in 1971 was not particularly green. It was a beige rectangle with uncomfortable furniture, a makeup counter running along one wall, and a television monitor mounted in the corner that showed a feed from the studio floor. There was a courtesy bar, not elaborate, but functional. Scotch, bourbon, a few bottles of wine that no one touched, mixers that no one used. By the time Dean arrived, Johnny was already on stage doing his monologue, which they could hear through the walls as a series of muffled peaks. Setup, punchline, laughter. The rhythm as familiar and comforting as a heartbeat. The green room held, in addition to Wayne and Martin, a junior producer named Larry Gelford who was 26 years old. It was his third week on the job, and who would later describe that evening in a 2004 interview with a television historian as the night I understood that everything I thought I knew about these men was completely wrong. There was also a makeup artist named Gloria, who had been doing celebrity makeup at NBC for 11 years, and who had therefore seen approximately everything and was immune to approximately everything, but who would later admit to her daughter that this particular evening had unnerved her in ways she couldn't entirely explain. And there was the drinks. Wayne had arrived at the studio, by Gelford's account, already carrying what a charitable observer might call a glow, and what a less charitable one would call a significant head start. He wasn't falling down. He wasn't slurring badly. He was, in a specific way, a very large man with very high tolerances, present but altered. His eyes a fraction slower, his voice a fraction louder, his tendency toward declarative statement a fraction more pronounced. Dean, when he arrived, assessed the situation with the instant expertise of a man who had spent decades performing alongside various degrees of inebriation and understood the way a sailor understands weather. He poured himself a moderate scotch, settled into the chair across from Wayne, and the two men sat in particular silence of people who have things to say to each other and have agreed, implicitly, to say none of them. Gelford, hovering nervously near the monitor, was trying to determine whether he should alert someone, a producer, a segment coordinator, anyone, about the state of the guests in the first chair. He was trying to calculate what protocol was in this situation, and arriving repeatedly at the answer that he didn't know. Because no one had told him. Because no one had imagined the specific scenario was possible. It was Dean who broke the silence. "You see the reviews for Big Jake?" he asked Wayne, referring to the Western that had come out earlier that year. Wayne made a sound that was halfway between acknowledgement and dismissal. Said you were magnificently antique. Dean said, and there was something the way he said it, not cruel, but not entirely kind either, that made Gelford tense. Wayne looked at him slowly. "They write about me," he said, "the way they write about a museum, like I'm behind glass already." There was a beat. "Maybe we all are," Dean said quietly. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical weight that a screenwriter would have given it, just a small, almost imperceptible relaxation, the way two animals who have been circling each other will sometimes simply stop. "I heard about the Playboy thing," Dean said. Wayne said nothing. "I didn't read it," Dean added, "but I heard." Everyone heard. Wayne said, "Did you mean it?" A long pause. Wayne looked at the television monitor, where Johnny was now conducting an interview with a comedian, leaning forward in that way he had, projecting attention. "I meant some of it," Wayne said finally. "I meant it the way you mean things when you're tired of being careful." Dean turned his glass slowly in his hand. "Yeah," he said, "I know that feeling." Gelford would remember later that this was the moment when he first understood that these two men were not, whatever else they might be, enemies. They were something more complicated, and in some ways more volatile than enemies. They were mirrors. Men who had spent so long performing versions of American masculinity. Wayne stoic, righteous, uncomplicated cowboy. Martin smooth, untroubled, irresistible charmer. That they had both arrived by different roads at the same exhausted destination. The performance was getting heavy, and neither of them had any idea how to put it down. At 11:47 p.m., the floor manager knocked on the green room door. "2 minutes, gentlemen." Wayne stood with the careful deliberateness of a large man, making sure his legs are going to cooperate. He was wearing a dark suit with a beyond-the-lookout tie, the BOLO tie being one of those Wayne signatures that somehow worked on him the way it would work on no other human being alive. And he looked from a distance, like exactly what the audience expected. A monument, a landmark. John Wayne. Dean stood, adjusted his jacket with a small practice motion. and they walked together down the corridor toward the studio, Jell Ford trailing behind with the expression of a man who has just watched two weather systems converge and is not certain what kind of storm they're going to produce. The studio audience applauded as they appeared, and the applause was genuine and substantial. For Wayne especially, a roar that seemed to rise from somewhere older than the moment, from all those darkened theaters and Saturday matinees and first experiences of what heroism might look and sound like. Wayne raised a hand, smiled. The smile was the real one, not the performed one, warm, slightly surprised still, after all these decades, by the warmth coming back at him. Dean sat on the couch with fluid ease, settling in as though this particular orange sofa in this particular television studio was exactly where it always intended to be. He crossed his legs, picked up the glass of water that had been placed for him, and looked completely comfortable in a way that only very uncomfortable people learn to look. Johnny came around the desk to shake hands, and watching the three of them together, Carson, Wayne, Martin, three men in their prime or past it, but none of them willing to admit it, three monuments to a certain idea of American male success. You feel, even from across the studio floor, the specific electricity of the moment. Jell Ford stood at the back of the studio. He had stopped trying to calculate protocols. He was simply watching. The first segment went well. Johnny asked Wayne about Big Jake, and Wayne talked about it with the easy authority of a man discussing his craft. Which scenes had been hard, which had surprised him, what it was like to work with his son Patrick on screen. He was charming, he was funny, he was a duke. Dean chimed in occasionally with a light, deft interjections that were his specialty. Not stealing focus, not competing, just enriching the conversation the way a harmony line enriches a melody. He told a story about running into Wayne on a movie lot in 1963 that made the audience laugh, and Wayne laughed genuinely. The big, helpless laugh that sat deep in his chest. Johnny was relaxed, enjoying himself. This was what the show was at its best. Three people who were interesting, talking with America watching. And then someone in the audience shouted something. It came from the fourth row, left section. Later accounts would disagree on the exact phrasing. The audio recording, which existed in imperfect form on a reference tape that would itself become the subject of significant legal and archival drama, captured as a male voice, middle-aged or older, projecting with the confidence of someone who has had a few drinks and has decided that his opinion deserves a larger audience. What he said, or what he appeared to say, with the caveat that the audio quality left meaningful room for interpretation, was directed at John Wayne. It referenced the Playboy interview. It was not kind. In a studio audience of 312 people, the vast majority heard it, processed it, and held their breath. The handful who hadn't heard it understood from the sudden quality of the silence that something had entered the room that wasn't supposed to be there. Johnny Carson heard it. He turned very slightly toward the audience, a barely perceptible pivot, and in the fraction of a second before he could deploy the entire vast arsenal of his hosting skill to neutralize the moment, something happened that no one had anticipated. John Wayne stood up, not the casual, unhurried standing of a man who intends to say something measured, not the slow unfolding of age and gravity that had characterized his rising from the couch earlier. This was different. This was the standing up of a man whose body had responded before his mind had engaged a break, the standing up of 64 years and a lung missing, and a face familiar to more human beings than almost any other face on earth, and a deep, marrow-level conviction that he was owed a certain respect that had just been publicly, audibly denied. He was on his feet. He was looking into the audience, and he had a glass of whiskey in his hand. What happened next takes approximately 4 seconds to describe and occupied in the memories of everyone present. Something considerably longer. Wayne's arm drew back. Dean Martin, in the peripheral vision of everyone watching, went very still. Not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of someone who has spent enough time around volatile situations to understand that absolute stillness is a correct response when something large and combustible is in motion. Johnny Carson's mouth opened. The glass left Wayne's hand in a shallow, underpowered arc. Not the controlled throw of someone who has made a decision, but the involuntary release of someone whose arm has acted without full instruction from a brain. The whiskey spiraled out of it in a golden ribbon, and the glass turned once, caught the studio lighting, and then everything seemed to happen simultaneously. The glass did not hit anyone. It sailed past the front row of the audience, Close enough to make two people in seats A7 and A8 flinch back. Close enough to make Jelford at the rear of the studio inhale sharply, and struck the edge of the first camera position, where it bounced and fell to the floor and did not break. The whiskey, however, went somewhere else. The whiskey went on to Johnny Carson. Not all of it, a dispersed spray of it, across the left shoulder and sleeve of his jacket, catching the desk, catching his papers, leaving a specific, unmistakable smell of aged bourbon hanging in the air of the suddenly completely silent studio. Nobody moved. Nobody, for a moment that felt like a suspension of all natural law, made a sound. And then Dean Martin said something. He said it in a voice so quiet that the audience microphones barely caught it. And what they caught was debated for years afterward by the small but passionate community of people who became obsessed with this recording. But the most widely accepted transcription of what Dean Martin said, in the breathless aftermath of John Wayne throwing a glass of whiskey at a heckler and hitting the host of The Tonight Show instead, was this: "Duke, sit down." 2 words, 4 syllables, no performance in them, no ease, no charm, no smooth Italian-American river, just a voice stripped to something real, quiet, direct, and carrying in the particular authority of someone who is not afraid of the man he is speaking to. John Wayne sat down. The commercial break was called 40 seconds later. In those 40 seconds, several things happened. Johnny Carson looked down at his jacket sleeve. He touched the wet fabric with 2 fingers. He looked up. He looked at Wayne. He looked at Dean. His expression cycled through several things in rapid succession: shock, anger, something that might have been fear, and then, finally, the extraordinary self-control that had been his professional signature for 9 years. He laughed. Not a big laugh. Not a performance. A short, sharp, disbelieving exhale of laughter that was also, if you watched it closely, and Jelford, from the back of the room, watched it very closely, a decision. Johnny Carson had decided, in that moment, what this was going to be. He was going to laugh. Because if he laughed, the audience could laugh. And if the audience laughed, they were still in a television studio and not in the aftermath of something that would require lawyers and publicists and congressional attention. But the audience didn't know yet whether to laugh or not. They were still processing. The floor manager appeared, urgent and pale. The commercial break sign went up. The house band, reading a room with the expertise of musicians who have played through many an unexpected crisis, came a fraction too early with something upbeat, and the sound was almost comically inappropriate. Bright, bouncy, utterly at odds with the frozen tableau on the stage. Wayne sat with his hands on his knees, staring at the floor. Dean had shifted almost imperceptibly, closer to Wayne now than he had been before, the kind of physical proximity that communicates something without requiring words. He wasn't comforting Wayne. He wasn't managing him. He was simply there, present, awaiting the room. 2 producers came down from the booth. There was a hurried, low-voiced conversation at the desk with Johnny. He nodded twice. His jacket was blotted with a towel someone produced with impressive speed. The man in the 4th row had been firmly escorted from the building by 2 security personnel who materialized with the same efficient speed. And then, because this is a Tonight Show and the show must and will and always does go on, the commercial break ended and the camera lights went green and Johnny Carson was back at his desk, a new jacket acquired from somewhere, his expression composing itself back into that familiar, warm, unrevealing professionalism. "Where were we?" he said. The audience laughed, nervously at first, then more genuinely, because Johnny was fine. Johnny was fine. Therefore they were fine. Therefore everything was fine. But everything was not fine. The remaining 17 minutes of that evening's show were, by surface appearance, functional. Wayne was quieter than before, subdued in the specific way of large men who have been startled by their own actions, who had caught a glimpse of something in themselves that they weren't expecting and found it alarming. He answered Johnny's questions. He made 2 or 3 attempts at humor that landed incompletely. He did not look at the audience. Dean carried the segment. This was, and you understand this only if you understand Dean Martin deeply, an act of considerable skill and considerable generosity. He could have retreated. He could have protected his own image, his own careful performance of cool, by simply withdrawing from the energy of the moment. Instead, he did the thing he was best at. He made the conversation human. He talked to Wayne directly, asked him questions about his kids, drew out stories from the set of True Grit, made Johnny laugh twice with well-timed understatements. He was, in a word, holding the room together and doing it while making it look effortless, which was either the greatest kindness or the cruelest irony, because what it meant was that no one watching at home, when the broadcast aired the following evening, would have any idea that anything unusual had happened, because of course, the broadcast never aired. Not that episode. Not ever. It was made in a conference room on the second floor of the NBC Burbank building, between approximately 1:15 and 2:45 in the morning. Present, according to multiple accounts assembled over the subsequent decades, Johnny Carson, Wayne's manager and attorney, a representative of Dean Martin's business team, 2 senior NBC executives, and, sitting in the corner with a legal pad he apparently never wrote anything on, a man whose role no one has been entirely able to identify, described by Jill Ford, who glimpsed him through the glass partition, as someone who looked like he was there to remind everyone what the consequences were. What was discussed in that room in specific terms has never been fully confirmed. What is known from the account of several people who were adjacent to the decision, who heard things through walls or were briefed afterward, is this: NBC did not want to broadcast the episode because of the liability question around the thrown glass. However close it had come to the audience, however absent any actual injury, the network's lawyers were not comfortable with a broadcast that showed a major celebrity apparently hurling a projectile, however half-heartedly, in the direction of the public. Wayne's team concurred for different and more personal reasons. What that episode contained, not just a throw, but what it revealed about the state of the man, the alcohol, the raw nerve that the heckler had struck, was not consistent with the image that 7 decades of careful cultivation had built. The Playboy interview had already done damage. This could not be put on top of it. Dean Martin's representative said almost nothing during the meeting, according to one account. At the conclusion, he asked a single question: what does Johnny want? What Johnny wanted, apparently, was for it to be over. The tape was pulled from the broadcast schedule. The episode number was reassigned to a rerun. The official explanation, deployed to the handful of TV critics and entertainment journalists who noticed a gap, was scheduling adjustments. No one pressed hard enough to find the real answer. The tape was placed in a storage facility. The story was, to all appearances, over. But here is what the conference room did not discuss. Here is what was left in the room when the lawyers left and the executives left, and Wayne and Dean and Johnny went back to their respective hotels and their respective lives. In the 17 minutes after the commercial break, in the segment that almost no one saw, that was recorded but never broadcast, that existed only on a tape in a locked cabinet in the basement, something had happened that was more important than the throw, more revealing than the heckle, more nakedly human than any of them had intended. It had happened during a moment when Johnny, with the instinct of a great interviewer, had asked what seemed like a simple question. He had turned to Wayne in that gentle, unassuming way he had, the way that made people feel safe enough to be honest, and said, "Duke, can I ask you something? When you did that interview, the Playboy one, what were you actually trying to say?" A long pause. The audience waited. "I don't know," Wayne said. 3 words. Simple. Undefended. "I think I was trying to say that I'm tired." He continued, and his voice had something in it that the audience hadn't heard before, something that didn't belong to John Wayne, the symbol, but to Marion Morrison, the man, the Iowan, the 64-year-old with one lung who had been performing invincibility for so long that he had genuinely forgotten, in some fundamental way, that he was not. "I'm tired of the world being more complicated than I know how to talk about. I'm tired of saying the wrong thing. I'm tired of," he stopped. "I'm just tired." Silence. And then Dean Martin, who had been quiet through this, who had been sitting with his glass turned slowly in his hands, said something. He said, "I think we all say things when we're tired that we'd take back if we could. I think we do things too." A pause. "I threw a punch at a photographer in '65 that I'd give a lot to have back. Not because of the legal trouble, because it showed something I didn't want to be." He looked at Wayne. "You're not a bad man, Duke. You're a tired man who said something bad." Another silence. "Is that different?" Wayne asked. "Yeah." Dean said, "I think it is." Johnny Carson said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, almost himself, but the microphone caught it, he said, "I hope so." When a television historian tracked down Larry Gelford more than 30 years later, retired in Scottsdale, Arizona, growing tomatoes and watching old shows on the early internet, he was willing to talk. He talked for 6 hours over 2 days. He talked about the green room, the silence, the throw. He talked about the conference room. He glimpsed through glass. But the part of the story he kept returning to, the part that seemed to still live in him with its full original weight, was at 17 minutes after the break. "People focus on the glass," he said. "People think the story is about John Wayne throwing a glass of whiskey and hitting Johnny Carson. And sure, that's the headline. That's the thing that gets people interested." He paused. But that wasn't the story. The story was what came after. The story was three men who had everything, who the whole country thought had everything, sitting on a stage in Burbank at midnight, and one of them said, "I'm tired," and meant in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He shook his head slowly, and nobody was allowed to see it. And I've thought about that my whole life. I've thought about what it would have meant if that had aired. If people had seen John Wayne, say, "I'm tired," and not mean it as weakness, but as honesty. If they'd seen Dean Martin hold something together with nothing but decency. If they'd seen Johnny Carson sit with it and not try to fix it. He was quiet for a moment. I think it would have changed something. I don't know what, but something. The tape did not stay in Burbank. In 1974, a large portion of NBC's archive was moved to a storage facility in New Jersey as part of a cost-cutting measure. The tape moved with it, tucked inside its do not broadcast repeat sleeve, anonymous among thousands. In 1979, that facility was sold. A portion of the archive was transferred to a climate-controlled vault in upstate New York. The rest was, depending on the account, either sold to private collectors, donated to various universities, or, in the phrase that archivists use with the specific despair of people who had devoted their lives to preservation, lost. In 1981, John Wayne had been dead for 2 years, taken by the stomach cancer that had pursued him since before that October evening. Dean Martin was still performing, but more intermittently, his invincible ease beginning to show. Finally, the structural damage that had always been there beneath it. Johnny Carson was still on the air, still the king, still the last voice in America's bedrooms at night. None of them, apparently, had spoken publicly about that evening. None of them ever would. In 1993, 2 years before Dean Martin died, 3 years before Johnny Carson retired, 22 years after the evening in question, a graduate student named Patricia Weller was writing her dissertation on the representation of masculinity in post-war American popular culture. She had been given access to a collection of miscellaneous NBC materials that had ended up, through a series of transactions too complicated to fully trace, in the possession of a small private archive in New Jersey. She found the tape on a Wednesday afternoon in November. The sleeve was faded. The do not broadcast repeat notation was still legible, though the ink had bled slightly into the cardboard. The reel inside was in poor condition, warped slightly from years of imperfect storage, the edges of the tape showing the first signs of deterioration. She almost didn't request a playback. The tape was unlabeled except for the episode number and the notation, and she was looking for specific things, commercials, primarily as source material for her chapter on the commodification of masculine identity. A Tonight Show episode from 1971 was not, on its surface, what she was looking for. She requested the playback because she was thorough. And because she was thorough, she sat in a small, cold viewing room in New Jersey on a Wednesday afternoon in November 1993 and watched something that almost no living person had seen. She watched it twice. Then she sat in the viewing room for a while, without requesting a rewind. The tape was damaged. The first segment was almost entirely unwatchable, degraded to abstract patterns of color and corrupted audio. But the second segment, beginning approximately 2 minutes into the post-commercial portion, was largely intact. Some dropout, some tracking errors, but the images held, the audio held. She saw the tail end of the tension, could read it in body language without context for it, could see that something had happened before the break, even without being able to see what. She saw Wayne's subdued stillness. She saw Dean's watchfulness. She saw Johnny's deliberate, professional normalcy, the performance of fineness, And she saw, as Jill Ford had seen it, the moment it cracked. She saw Wayne say, "I'm tired," and mean it in the way that people mean things when a performance drops. She saw Dean say, "You're not a bad man, Duke. You're a tired man who said something bad," and she saw what that cost him. Could see it cost him something. Could see that this wasn't a smooth, effortless Dean Martin persona, but the man underneath, doing something effortful out of decency. And she saw Johnny Carson, the man whose job was to be always present and never personal. Look at the camera, not at Wayne, not at Dean, but the camera at them, at the unseen audience he'd been talking to for 9 years, and say, "I hope so," in a voice that had nothing in it except the honest hope of a man who was not sure. Patricia Weller did not include the tape in her dissertation. She thought about it. She debated it. She was a rigorous academic with a strong instinct toward primary source material, and this was primary source material of considerable significance. But she thought about the 3 men on the screen, 1 dead, 2 still living. And she thought about the fact that whatever moment of honesty this tape contained, it had been surrounded and suppressed by every force of image management and institutional protection that 1971 Hollywood could bring to bear. And she thought about whether she had the right to override that. She wrote to NBC's legal department instead, included a brief description of what she had found. She never received a reply. She wrote again 6 months later. Still nothing. The tape, as far as she knew, went back into the archive. Here's the thing about secrets that breathe and expand inside walls. Jill Ford talked in 2004. His interview circulated, slowly, in a particular ecosystem of late-night television history enthusiasts who were, in 2004, beginning to find each other online. Other accounts began to surface. A camera operator who had worked the show that evening. A makeup artist, not Gloria, who had died in 1987, but an apprentice who had been in a room and remembered specific details with the specificity of people who witness things that don't make sense at the time and spend the subsequent decades trying to make sense of them. Patricia Weller, by now a professor at a university in the Northeast, gave an interview to a podcast in 2009, one of the early ones, before podcasts became saturated, in which she described finding the tape with academic caution, naming nothing, claiming nothing, but describing with scholarly precision what she had seen. The internet being what the internet is, the claim spread, it was exaggerated in some iterations, flattened in others. It became, in certain corners of the amateur history community, the subject of the particular obsessive reconstruction that people undertake when they know something real happened but can't access the full version of it. Various people claimed to have seen it. Most of them were lying or confused, mixing other memories with the legend of this one. A few, a very few, described details that tracked enough against confirmed accounts to suggest they might have actually seen something. The tape itself has not been located, at least not publicly. NBC, in response to various inquiries over the years, has given answers ranging from no record of such an episode to archive materials from that period are not publicly accessible to, in one notable 2018 email exchange made public by the Inquirer, a response that acknowledged the existence of the episode number but stated that the status of the original recording is currently unknown. Currently unknown. Not destroyed. Not lost. Not confirmed gone. Unknown. Here's a life lesson that this story holds, wrapped inside all the drama and scandal and whiskey and famous names. It is not about John Wayne throwing a glass. That is the headline, the hook, the thing that gets you in the door. It is not about the cover-up, though the cover-up is real and instructive in its own right. A reminder that even in an age before every moment was documented and shared, the powerful could and did suppress inconvenient truths with efficiency and without consequence. The lesson is in those 17 minutes. The lesson is in what happens when performance drops. Wayne had spent 64 years building the most recognizable, most beloved, most commercially successful image in the history of American cinema. An image of total, uncomplicated competence. An image of a man who never doubted, never wavered, never said, "I don't know," and meant it. An image so powerful that when the real man underneath it, tired, aging, missing a lung, increasingly bewildered by a country that seemed to be becoming unrecognizable, tried to express his confusion, the only language he had available was blunt and ugly and hurt people. Because nobody had ever taught Marion Morrison that it was okay to say, I'm tired, because the image, which was his life's work and his fortune and his identity, had no room for tired. And Dean Martin, who seemed to have everything figured out, who performed ease with such mastery that it looked like the real thing, had spent 30 years doing the same thing in his own register, performing a man with no needs, no weights, no fears that a good song and a glass of something amber couldn't dissolve. And what the tape captured in those 17 minutes that almost no one saw was both of them briefly, accidentally, doing the thing that their entire careers had been structured to prevent. Being real, not heroically real, not inspirationally real, just humanly, quietly, somewhat messily real. Tired men admitting they were tired. Flawed men acknowledging the flaw, without converting it into narrative redemption. Johnny Carson, the consummate performer, the man who lived most authentically in the presence of an audience, sitting with it instead of fixing it, and saying, "I hope so," to the camera in the voice of a man who wasn't sure. The tape was suppressed because it was inconvenient, because it complicated too many images, because a version of these men that existed in the world's imagination had enormous commercial and cultural value, and honesty was a threat to that value. But Patricia Weller sat in a cold room in New Jersey and watched it twice. And Larry Gelford grew tomatoes in Scottsdale and thought about it his whole life. And the people who were in that studio audience, 312 of them, seated in their rows, who saw without cameras the whole unedited truth, carried it home with them, and some of them told their spouses or their friends or their children about the night John Wayne stood up on The Tonight Show and then sat back down, and about what happened after. Stories travel differently than tapes. Stories don't degrade. They don't get mis-stored or administratively disappeared or placed in locked cabinets with "do not broadcast repeat" written on the sleeve. Stories breathe. Somewhere tonight, in a climate-controlled vault or a private collector's basement or a university archive that hasn't fully cataloged its holdings, or a storage unit in New Jersey that the current owner has never fully examined, a 2-inch videotape reel sits inside a faded cardboard sleeve. The label is worn. The tape inside is further degraded than it was when Patricia Weller found it in 1993, but not entirely gone. On it, 3 men in a studio in Burbank, October 1971. One of them has just done something the world will never be shown. One of them has just said something the world was never meant to hear. And the third one is sitting with both of them, not fixing it, not performing around it, just present with the full weight of what was real in that room on that night. John Wayne died in June 1979. He was 72 years old, and he had given more to mythology of American manhood than any single human being perhaps should be asked to give. Whether he found, in the end, any peace with the gap between what he had performed and what he had felt, no one can say with confidence. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, a day that seemed both appropriate and cruel. He had never fully recovered from the death of his son Dino Jr. in a military aircraft crash in 1987, and those who knew him in his final years said that the performance had finally, irreversibly dropped, not to reveal something ugly, just to reveal a quietness. A tired man who had stopped pretending not to be tired. Johnny Carson died in January 2005 at his home in Malibu, surrounded by the privacy he had always sought and never quite achieved. He had been, to the end, a man who lived most fully when the cameras were on him, and who spent the rest of his time trying to figure out what that meant. He never spoke publicly about the evening of October 13th, 1971. None of them did, but the tape is still out there. And some things, no matter how many people try to delete them, no matter how many locked cabinets and legal letters and do not broadcast labels, refuse to disappear. Because the truth, even the imperfect, inconvenient, unseeable truth, is more durable than the image. It always has been. It always will be. 3 men walked into a television studio trying to maintain their legends. One of them threw something he couldn't take back. One of them held the room together with nothing but quiet decency. And one of them looked at the camera and told the honest, uncertain truth. We never saw it, but somewhere it's still playing. And